Well, there the president said he didn't want to talk about it in that venue. And sort of at the time, it did seem pretty clear that there was something afoot. You learned over the years covering the president, sort of how to read some between the lines on the things he says. It did seem to be something that was afoot there. Did we expect it to come an hour and a half, 2 hours after he finished a marathon press conference? No, it was a little, in some ways, a surprising bit of discipline for the president, who often will, when there are personnel changes like this afoot, will just blurt them out when asked. And here he said he wanted to give Sessions his own time. Didn't want to make it part of that of the post midterm ritual of the president holding that press conference. He wanted to do it separately in the tweet, as we've seen so often from the president. So this has been underway for quite some time. It shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, but certainly coming so quickly as an indication of just about how thinly a thread Sessions has been hanging on for so long.
If you can hang with us, Zeke, for a second, I want to bring in CBS News legal analyst Ricky Kleeman, who joins us now by phone. Ricky, as Zeke said, this is not a surprise. We knew at some point this was coming. Many people have worried about what this means for the Mueller probe.
Well, of course, I think that is going to be the first question on the minds of Democrats in particular, because one of the things that we know never occurred was that there was never any legislation passed to protect Robert Mueller. So does this mean that ultimately there's a fall of the dominoes? But I think that we shouldn't overreact to that point, because we should look at how the Justice Department has to work. When the Attorney General is gone, the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, who is the current number 2 at the Justice Department, he has to automatically take his place according to statute. But the other problem, of course, we know is Trump has been unhappy with Sessions from the beginning once Sessions recused himself from the Russia investigation. So the last person he wants as his number 2 is going to be Rod Rosenstein. So then you go down the further line of succession. If Rosenstein is fired or quits, then the Solicitor General, Noel Francisco, would be elevated. Well, we could keep playing this little domino game. But it is also possible that the president could pick someone else entirely. And when you're dealing with the Federal Vacancies Act, he could really pick someone who has a Senate-confirmed position. So, this could be a lot of stuff in flux if the decision was truly Jeff Sessions and not the president.
Ricky, we're hearing Schumer. We were just covering before this news broke a live press conference talking about midterms and the results, and he was warning about a constitutional crisis if it leads to tampering with the Mueller probe. What do you make of that?
Well, I do think that that's a valid concern. I'm old enough to remember the Saturday Night Massacre. And if the purpose, once Jeff Sessions is gone, at least at this moment of his own accord, if Rod Rosenstein is then gone, then if someone's elevated who would remove Robert Mueller, that would create, in many ways, the horrible cliche, but the truth of a constitutional crisis. And I don't think that the Democrats would stand for it. Keep in mind this, however, as a result of the midterms. The Senate, in and of itself, is clearly in Republican hands as it was before. And you're dealing with confirmation and issues more in the Senate here than you are in the House. I would hope that it never comes to that, but nothing would surprise me considering the president's feelings about the Mueller probe, which he has called a hoax from beginning to end.
I want to play a bite for you from Senator Schumer just a short time ago, reacting to this breaking news that Attorney General Jeff Sessions has resigned at President Trump's request.
But I'd say this: protecting Mueller and his investigation is paramount. It would create a constitutional crisis if this were a prelude to ending or greatly limiting the Mueller investigation. And I hope President Trump and those he listens to will refrain from that. Now, I want to take, let's see what we should do here. I mean, I know you'll want to have other questions on this, but let's.
I want to also bring in Zeke Miller, who joins us as well, who's at the White House. Zeke, any reaction from White House officials? I know this news just broke, but when you talked about this to them, what was their take on it? We also know that on the campaign trail, the president has spoken pretty aggressively about his temporary replacement.
Yeah, certainly, talking to some White House officials, the initial quick reaction from them over text has been largely, we all knew this was coming. There's nobody is surprised here. They are also signaling, we heard the president in his press conference a couple of hours ago make very clear that if he wanted to, he can fire everyone at the Justice Department involved in the Mueller probe, including the special counsel. That's his interpretation of the statute there, but that he's decided not to do so for both political concerns, mostly for political concerns. So there is not an indication here that this is part of a larger purge or however else you want to describe it, sort of a cleaning out of the Justice Department or even an assault on the Mueller probe itself. The president has been very clear that he believes it's a witch hunt, but according to White House officials, this is Sessions focused and largely reflects the relationship that has not been a strong personal relationship between the two, and the president believes that he is entitled to a strong personal relationship with his attorney general, one of his sort of the big four cabinet members. Any sense, Zeke, as to why now? In terms of today, hours after, I think there's an element of, the nation has been consumed by the outcome of this midterm election. So now today is the day that you can sort of almost take it out, and it doesn't make it as big a story. That's one interpretation here at the White House, and also that this has been in the works for quite some time, and that Sessions potentially just didn't want to hang on very much longer. The president didn't want to hang on very much longer either. But at the same time, you certainly hear from PR professionals and others in the Republican Party saying that the president just took a big victory lap in the East Room of the White House, and here he is essentially stepping on that on his own news with this Sessions essentially a firing as forced resignation. So that will be will be to be determined. Does this break some of the momentum the president was feeling just a few hours ago with the American public? Zeke, have we heard anything? We all knew that Mueller wouldn't weigh in before midterms. That was the thinking. Do we know anything further about when we might expect anything to come down with this investigation? And has the president, remind us again, has the president been interviewed or submitted questions to Mueller? Well, the president hasn't been interviewed. We've heard from the president and others that he's in discussions with his lawyers about responding to some written questions from the special counsel team. It's not clear if those have been transmitted back or the extent of the cooperation from the president with the special counsel. Certainly, in terms of the Mueller's timeline, that is sort of the million-dollar question in Washington. Nobody really has a whole lot of visibility. We sort of got indications that there was going to be a freeze in the run-up to Election Day, but now that Election Day is in the rearview mirror, could we see it reawaken? Could we see it accelerate? What would that look like? Those are all the questions that right now can't exactly be answered. That really, just like yesterday, determined the control of Congress. And ultimately, with it, some of the course of the Trump presidency, so too can the next couple of weeks and months of the Mueller probe. What the special counsel does and how he does it will certainly hang over the Trump presidency for the next several years. Yeah, it certainly will. For those of you joining us now, we have just received word President Trump has announced that Attorney General Jeff Sessions has tendered his resignation at the request of the president. So if you're following us, this is definitely a forced resignation. Sessions' chief of staff, Matthew G. Whitaker, will take over as acting attorney general. On the phone with us now, Rebecca Roiphe. She's a former assistant district attorney for New York County. She joins us now. Rebecca, I want to get your legal take on all of this.
Well, I think this is a very serious step. Personally, I think that the president is sending a message to the House of Representatives. He said that he was going to engage in warlike tactics if they try to investigate him or subpoena his taxes, and I think this is a first step in that direction. Matthew Whitaker has written an article suggesting that he thinks that the Mueller probe has gone too far. So if that's any indication of how he actually feels, I think that's an indication of where things are going to go.
So remind us again, he's obviously the acting attorney general, but just the attorney general as a whole. What type of influence does the attorney general have over something like the Mueller probe?
Well, the Attorney General had no influence when it was Jeff Sessions because Jeff Sessions recused himself from the investigation. But an Attorney General who didn't recuse himself would have a lot of control, not absolute control. So the regulations do create some distance, but there's always a reporting back to the Attorney General, and the Attorney General is really responsible for the entire probe in general. So he would have a lot of power over Mueller and the investigation.
All right, if you can hang with us for just a second, I want to bring in our panel who's back with us again on set. CBSN contributor Leslie Sanchez, a Republican strategist, Caitlin Huey-Burns, CBSN political reporter, and also joining us as well, Joel, I want to thank you, who's a Democratic strategist as well, Joel Payne. I want to ask you, Caitlin, first, sort of the political reporting component of this all. You know, Matthew Whitaker has written an article on this, expressing concern about the Mueller probe. Can they counter on that? Can anyone on Capitol Hill say this isn't the person that we want? Can the president just appoint this person?
Well, it will be very interesting, but remember, the president now has an expanded majority in the Senate, and that's really critical. Remember, we were talking about what that would actually mean to have more Republicans in the Senate for judicial nominations, but now for cabinet officials, because we knew that there would be some kind of exodus. We knew kind of Jeff Sessions would be on the firing line, really, not thinking that it would come actually today. And also, you know, it's important to point out that Jeff Sessions said that he is resigning at your request, which is a firing. Yeah. And so what this means for the Mueller probe, you're going to have, you know, Democrats now in the House are in charge of all of these committees, particularly the Intelligence Committee. They're going to have some power here on the committee level to try to rein this in. But remember, there was no legislation passed on Capitol Hill to protect the special counsel investigation. Republicans said over and over and over again that the president would not fire anybody here. But we also heard from people like Lindsey Graham, an ally of the president, kind of alluding to the fact that, or alluding to the idea that Trump would, in fact, let go of Sessions because he had lost confidence in him after the midterms. And now we're, of course, just the day after midterms.
Leslie, I'm curious, folks on Capitol Hill, Republicans in particular, where do you think folks will stand on this?
I think it's going to fall both ways. There's going to be a talking point side of the Republican side. The president you serve at the pleasure of the president. This is something that he's struggled with because the president felt that many of his initial nominees did not make it through confirmation, that were his true loyalists. And you have to think about there's still many Senate confirmed positions that are not filled within the administration. A lot of that has to do with the president doesn't think he needs some of those positions, but more so there is a battle line in most of these, and particularly Department of Justice, between the politicals who are establishment politicals, came in, worked in previous administrations, know those jobs, and the Trumpites, so to speak, that come in and are loyal to the president, full stop. Mm-hmm. And they have clashed, and repeatedly the Trump loyalists have left. Mm-hmm. So now it's this pressure of who's going to win. And I think the president's telling you right now he's going to clear house. And that's been coming. We know that was coming in some other agencies. Going to clean house, put in his true loyalist, which opens up the second part, the privacy that you've had in terms of no leaks coming out of the Mueller investigation, because there's very few people who know all the different components. I think that's why you saw the special counsel accelerating his ability to get to the finish line, because I think he also knew something like this would happen, maybe not at this pace, but it's now going to be opening up and reporting, the reporting we talked about, who's the reporting going to go to, and circling that back to the White House. That's really where it gets questionable.
And I think we can say that the president feels emboldened after last night's victories in the Senate. And, you know, having covered a lot of these Senate campaigns, you would hear from Republican voters that they, too, had lost confidence in Jeff Sessions. They would, you know, evoke the president's own language, calling the Mueller probe a witch hunt. And they would also, candidates and voters alike on the Republican side, would really, you know, support the president in this, which also, you know, after now expanding seats in the Senate, the president certainly feels some energy from that.
Joel, I'm going to get to you in just a second, but I want to turn now to CBS News correspondent Chip Reid, who joins us from the White House. Chip, what more do we know? How is the president framing this decision?
Well, we don't know a lot more details about it, but we do know that he was asked about it at that extraordinary an extraordinarily contentious press conference earlier today. Our own Major Garrett was in the room, and he said to the president, "Can you give us clarity, sir, on your thinking currently, now after the midterms, on your attorney general and your deputy attorney general? Do they have long-term job security?" The president said, "I'd rather answer that at a little bit different time." Very little different time. Just a couple hours later, he decided it was the time to lower the boom on Jeff Sessions. He said, "We're looking at different people for different positions. You know, it's very common after the midterms. I didn't want to do anything before the midterms." He didn't want to upset the apple cart then, but wow, he sure is upsetting it now. It's a question of how many apples will fall or how many dominoes, whatever metaphor you want to use, will go. Will Rod Rosenstein be next, the Deputy Attorney General who oversees the Robert Mueller investigation? And could Robert Mueller be in the sights of the president? He was also asked about that today. He didn't really say yes or no. He simply said, "I could fire everybody if I wanted to," although I must say that is in question as to what power he has to fire Robert Mueller. Rena?
Our Chip Reid coming to us from the White House. Chip, thank you very much for that. I want to turn now to Jeff Pegues, CBS News Justice and Homeland Security correspondent. Jeff, the fact that this has come now, timing is everything in Washington. Can we read anything into this, that the Mueller probe may be coming to an end, or there might be a significant shoe to drop soon?
Well, okay, if you want me to read into this, I will say it this way. You know, obviously, this is something the president has been talking about. There has been a discussion in Washington, in GOP circles, about when Attorney General Sessions would either be fired or resigned. So this is something that has been talked about. However, with the midterm election, it was sort of put on hold. And now that it's over, clearly the president didn't waste any time pushing Jeff Sessions out. Of course, there was a tweet that referred to Sessions resigning, but this was Sessions being fired. He enjoyed that job. You know, according to people who are close to him, who have worked with him, this was a job that he coveted. So he wasn't just going to leave this job easily. And in fact, the fact that he held on as long as he has, given the amount of criticism that he has received from the White House, specifically the president, is really remarkable, given the pressure that he has been under to resign sooner. But it comes now, and in a lot of ways, there are members of Congress, specifically in the Senate, who essentially gave the president the green light to go ahead and do this. Lindsey Graham, for example, who said before the midterm elections that if the president made this move, maybe hold off and do it after the midterm elections. He was on the record saying that. So in a lot of ways, that was the green light that perhaps the president was looking for to take this step, because it is a controversial step. Because of where Attorney General Sessions stands in terms of the Russia investigation, he had to recuse himself. He looked to career DOJ prosecutors, asked them what he should do because of his controversial contacts with the Russian ambassador, Sergei Kislyak. And they advised him that he needed to step aside, recuse himself, and he did. But still, it was a move that just irked the president for months now. And there has been this speculation that the president wanted to make this move, and there were people within the White House that were trying to hold him back from making this move, but it comes today. And the timing, as you noted, is interesting. You know, you talk to a lot of people in Washington, and they will tell you there is no coincidence when it comes to timing. Things happen for a reason. The fact that Sessions is resigning now, obviously that's something that is happening for a reason. The president obviously wanted this to happen.
Jeff Pegues coming to us also from our D.C. bureau. Jeff, thank you very much for your insights. We're actually getting some reaction from GOP Senators. Chuck Grassley tweeting out, "Thanks to AG Jeff Sessions for his service to our country, both leading the DOJ in the U.S. Senate, serving the people of Alabama. I've enjoyed working with him for decades. He is a true public servant, and I appreciate his friendship." Chuck Grassley, I want to get your take, Joel.
Two things jump out to me. First, and this is a point that Caitlin started to make earlier, and I'd expand it a bit. The Republican base in the Senate, the actual number of Republicans in the Senate grew, but not just grew. There is now a more radicalized Republican GOP.
They're not just moderate.
Jeff Flake is gone. Bob Corker is gone. Rick Scott is in the Senate now. Trump loyalists are now filled throughout the Senate. Really, if you think about it, the only people you could see in the Republican caucus that would challenge President Trump on this, who? Ben Sasse, Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins. That's a small club to be in. And they have not, and it used to be Lindsey Graham. Lindsey Graham, as Jeff accurately pointed out, has said before the midterms that this is something that he supports the president on now in terms of replacing Jeff Sessions. So that's number one. Number two, the president said something interesting in his press conference today. He talked about a war posture that he would potentially assume with Democrats. And I actually think this is the president starting to set up.
If they went after him.
If they went after him. But I actually think he kind of tipped his hand there. I think he's trying to lure Democrats into this fight. Again, the president needs somebody to run against. This is setting up to be something that the president can go and create a battle and say, they campaigned on, they're going to use the subpoena power and they're going to investigate and they're going to gum up the works for the next 2 years. This is the opening salvo in that fight that he's trying to draw Democrats into.
But Leslie, talk to us a little bit, because the Mueller probe and where his tried and true base stands on this, he has written this off as a total witch hunt. Right. Does his base still believe that?
The base absolutely believes that this is a witch hunt, that he's being unfairly scrutinized. And the bigger question becomes when he was starting this kind of evaluating and moving into taxes and the business operations of the Trump hotels, the Trump business, Trump real estate, and all the different entities. That is a frightening point for any taxpayer in America. Nobody wants to have a special counsel because they will always find something. I mean, in terms of that. And that's probably what the president's trying to do. But always the president's trying to politicize this process. And you've had Sessions, in many cases, and the Republican Senate pushing back, saying, no, it's not. They've been taking distance and with that approach, not to politicize this. But this is changing. And if that's a very interesting idea to move it that way, because then you can really politicize the whole thing, politicize any report before it ever comes out, and it discounts any of the findings. And it's a very shrewd Machiavellian move, but it from a political perspective, it does take a very bold step.
And that's what the president has been doing this whole time, and it has had a corrosive effect. You look not only at Republican voters in polls who have said that they side with the president on Mueller, but also looking at independent voters, not wanting a continued, really, investigation into the president, wanting Congress to do more in terms of getting things done on economic issues and pocketbook issues and those sorts of things. So the president railing against Mueller, calling this whole thing a witch hunt, has really had an effect among Republicans, among other base voters. But what's interesting to hear from people like Grassley, you're not hearing any uproar yet from any Republicans, which kind of goes to your point that not only they expected this, but there's not really that appetite to challenge the president on this. We also have to note just who Jeff Sessions is to the president. Remember, he was the first member of Congress to endorse him, gave him that conservative credential, campaigned across the country for him, was a loyal defender of the president. And the president has been
worked side by side with many of these Republican
exactly, a former colleague, of course. And also, in terms of what he's been able to do, Democrats will tell you that he's been very effective, unfortunately, in their view, on the issue of immigration, for example, on tougher sentences for criminals, and those sorts of things, really carrying out the president's agenda that he campaigned on, which is the irony of the whole thing, which is that the president has overseen, looked over that and been very much focused only on the Russia probe.
Something else to watch out for. Now, these Democrats that were boxed in by the Kavanaugh vote, okay? So now we come up again. Now, Joe Manchin just won re-election, so you kind of take that off the board. But some of these Democrats now that are starting to try to watch not their left flank, but their right flank in some of these Trump states or some of these purple states, how are they going to react to this? Are you going to have the Democratic caucus in the Senate in lockstep against the president? Or are you going to have a few Democrats who decide to peel off after seeing what happened to Heidi Heitkamp and Joe Donnelly and seeing what Joe Manchin did and how he saved his seat? Is that going to be something that is learned from the last 2 months of what we've seen?
We're also looking in the House here, the incoming chair of the House Judiciary Committee, Jerry Nadler, saying Americans must have answers immediately as to the reasoning behind real Donald Trump removing Jeff Sessions from the Justice Department. Why is the president making this change? And who has authority over Special Counsel Mueller's investigation? We will be holding people accountable. Caitlin, when you hear that, the question's asked here, why is the president making this change? Who has authority over Special Counsel Mueller's investigation? Do we know the answer to that?
Well, Paula Reed is reporting that Whitaker will now oversee the probe. That just coming out. Democrats have been, really laser focused on this kind of behind the scenes and kind of preparing. And the White House had been preparing for the possibility that Mueller might come out with something soon. That's the other question I have, whether they were anticipating some news at the end of the week as it relates to
the timing is so particular. Why now,
is
right?
very interesting.
You just have this huge press conference. You've just blown away. We forgot we had midterms last night. We had a presidential press conference that blew midterms out. And then now we've got...
Distractions are everything in this White House. Yeah.
I want to bring in Ron Hosko for a second here, CBS News security consultant and former assistant director to the FBI. Ron, you and I talk quite a bit about institutions, democratic institutions, particularly FBI. When you look at the Department of Justice today, what does this mean for DOJ?
Well, look, I think that a lot of folks are going to put this in perhaps the perspective that, at least in my opinion, it ought to be in. This is personal between the president and his outgoing attorney general, who he is feels offended by Jeff Sessions' late recusal, insisting that had he told him in advance, he never would have been the attorney general. We've heard him lash out at the attorney general on a number of occasions. And that we know that the relationship has been irreparably harmed, irreparably damaged, and that it's very personal to the president. But these institutions, look, Jeff Sessions was new there 2 years ago. A number of his top staffers were new there, brought in with Jeff Sessions. The institutions will stand. They'll be there tomorrow. They'll be there next week. They will continue on with their mission. I said this when Jim Comey was relieved of his duties at the FBI. The FBI is much bigger than one person. The DOJ is much bigger than one person. Will there be, a lot of folks huddled around water coolers in DOJ and in the FBI and the components? Absolutely. Trying to figure out what's going to come next. Is it something that is predictable and seems to make sense, or is it something that is going to immerse not just the DOJ and perhaps the FBI, but the country in great controversy? We don't know. So the uncertainty that will have people buzzing, trying to predict and wonder what the next steps are going to be. But these organizations are much bigger than the small staffs that incoming attorneys general or FBI directors bring with them. These are thousands of people doing the job across the country, across the globe. They're not going to miss too many beats while they wait to hear what's next.
Ron, some people are wondering about funding, money. This isn't an endless amount of money that they're going to pour into the Mueller investigation. Some people say, could it take the wind out if this new acting attorney general, Matthew Whitaker, says, we're not going to fund it? Do you see something like that happening?
Well, I think that, anything is possible. You mentioned, I think, earlier, Rena, that Mr. Whitaker had written something about concluding the Mueller investigation. I think that probably mirrors lots of folks' opinion in America, that how long will this go on? Will it be endless like some other special counsel investigations in the past? It's too broad and needs to be more narrowly focused. And I think it would be prudent for a new overseer to ask those questions of Bob Mueller, to take a look at what's being spent and what's being returned. The great unknown here is really the unknown. It is what Mueller has in his possession right now that you and I don't know about, that is uniquely his, that is being very closely held, that certainly would be shared with an acting attorney general who is not recused. And that may be the guide that Mueller is either, closely on the scent of the final quarry, or, it's just not coming together in any bigger way. I think that may be determinative of what's the end game start to look like here. If it doesn't look like there's any big questions that are yet to be answered, there may be more encouragement for Mueller to start to wrap it up because of the impatience of the public, because of the impatience of a lot of folks out there. It would be wrong, and I think he will be judged by history if he wraps it up knowingly, prematurely. knowing that there is substantial evidence on additional significant players. And if he instructs Mueller to wrap it up, ultimately that will come out, and history, I think, would judge anyone who pushes that direction, would judge them harshly.
I want to get some news also from our Paula Reed. I know she was on the ground out in the Midwest covering some of the Senate races, but she's weighing in saying that Rod Rosenstein is no longer overseeing the Mueller probe. New acting Attorney General Matthew Whitaker is. This is from our Paula Reed, who covers the Department of Justice pretty aggressively. I want to turn to Caitlin Huey-Burns. Caitlin, we were talking a little bit about powers and how it falls with this incoming Congress. We know the Senate is stacked to where the president has a new cabinet member. He's going to get that in. Judicial nominee, going to get that in, right? So what does it mean? Dems still have a pretty thin majority in the House. How do you see this all playing out?
Well, you're going to see Dems wanting to conduct oversight on this and using all the tools that they can. But remember, we are talking now in November. They don't take control of Congress officially until January. So we're going to have a few more months of Republicans in full control here. The president clearly feels emboldened by these wins last night in the Senate, expanding his majority. And you only need a majority for cabinet appointments, for executive appointments, I should say, a simple majority, because they did away with the filibuster rule. So he can pretty easily get anybody confirmed that he would like. And I think what's really interesting here is that we haven't seen much pushback yet from Republicans. And to your point, the Jeff Flakes, the Bob Corkers, the others who might stand up to the president when it comes to firing Jeff Sessions are leaving, and they don't really have much sway in the conference anymore. So this is pretty telling that he's doing it now, feeling like he has the power to do it. And I will say, talking to Republican candidates on the Senate side and Republican voters on the Senate side, or who were voting for lawmakers this time around, there was this feeling that they felt very attached to the president in terms of being, defensive about the Mueller probe, and very much echoing his sentiments when it came to it.
I want to read some thoughts from Paula Reed, who's weighing in by email about Matthew Whitaker, who's going to be the acting attorney general. She says that he's been Sessions' chief of staff since first chief of staff Jody Hunt was appointed to lead the civil division. Folks inside the main Justice Department actually believe he's just a placeholder right now, not the permanent successor. So if that is the case, I'm not going to ask you guys who you think would replace him, but where do we see this going?
I think that the interesting part about this, I think we should back up a little bit. I think every day between now and the confirmation of the next Attorney General is going to matter. The clock is ticking very rapidly. I had heard somebody once describe the Mueller investigation as something that hit the ground running 100 miles an hour the first day they were authorized to proceed. So you have to understand, over all the amount of time that's continued, it's been a very methodical, and some would argue very effective investigation, though not what was the original intent. And that's where Republicans are going to come back. So you have competing interest, and now you have a disclosure that's going to be coming with this acting attorney general and the powers that see that. If you think about, we have seen cases in this administration where acting cabinet secretaries exceed what is traditionally the norm of being a placeholder. You can look at the Veterans Administration and Peter O'Rourke, who went and was terminating career officials and, was actually called up to Capitol Hill to explain a lot of his actions that are never done. And some would say that he was given that direction. The acting secretary was given that direction by the White House. We don't know if that's true, but if that is the case, it's a president who's running with scissors. So if that's the case, it's going to be a lot of puzzle pieces moving as the clock is ticking, getting to that next confirmation. And what does that allow the president to have access to in terms of information that maybe he didn't have before?
We heard Joel, the president, say just a short time ago, we heard a little talk about bipartisanship. We heard Nancy Pelosi talk a little bit about bipartisanship. I don't think it was an hour until we got the news about Sessions being fired. And now, I think it's pretty significant when you have a man like Representative Jerry Nadler saying, who could be the future House Judiciary Committee chairman, saying that he's going to push forward on this. He's not going to stand silently.
So, again, I think the president was emboldened by last night's results. And I think particularly the lesson that he took from it wasn't, let's make deals, let's be nice, all of the lip service he may be giving to a Nancy Pelosi today. That wasn't the lesson he took from it. The lesson he took is, double down, do Trump more, continue to do the Trump thing, more Trumpy every single day. And so I'm going to control the narrative. I'm going to be aggressive. I'm going to make people uncomfortable, and I'm going to run this presidency the way I want to run it outside of the conventions of Washington. And he is going to challenge Democrats. And again, we can't lose sight of the context of the 2020 presidential race, because again, as Leslie said, I think earlier, that has now started. So I think this president is telling you what his strategy is going to be, which is I'm going to push the tempo and I'm not going to allow Democrats to have any oxygen whatsoever to control the debate.
I want to bring in on the phone with us now Rebecca Roiphe. She is a former assistant district attorney for New York County. She joins us now. Rebecca, I think most folks don't understand what it is for a special counsel, how they operate. Give us a sense. What does a firing like this mean for Robert Mueller's probe and the special counsel there?
Well, look, I think everybody has said the special prosecutor is professional and he's been doing his job and he's a prosecutor who works like prosecutors do, and I think that's absolutely true. But he's not kept his head in the sand. He knows about all of these political maneuvers. So everything that that you've been talking about is something that he has not been unaware of. And my guess is, and again, it's a guess, it's reading tea leaves. My guess is he's anticipated all of this. And if he doesn't have indictments that are either already about ready to be filed, there may be ones that are under seal and we have no idea. And the court could unseal those indictments, and then there's nothing that anybody could do to stop the process. So I think there are ways in which he may have created a sort of or anticipated these moves and protected his work as a result. So before we all panic, I think it's worth remembering that we have something other than just the House of Representatives, which will ultimately be in Democratic control. We also have the court system, and that Mueller has been using that court system extremely wisely throughout this process, and my guess is he's still doing that.
Rebecca, he has been incredibly tight-lipped. I mean, leaks are pretty much non-existent with the Mueller team. But based on what we've known, the people he has subpoenaed, the testimony, things that have come through, what do you read about what he's been able to gather so far?
I really think that he's been working on the underlying question of whether or not there has been collusion. And it's possible to tell who he has indictments against or who he has proof against, but I think that ultimate question is a question that he has been pursuing. And there are tea leaves here and there that you can read, and I think that's clear. And there are Americans who were involved in the acts that he has already charged Russians for, and that those Americans are going to be charged for those crimes. And I just don't think that there's anything that the president can do at this point to stop that. Now, the other thing that he's been looking at is obstruction of justice. So if I were any of these officials who are involved in this change right now, I'd be awfully careful, just because anybody who has been seen as intentionally interfering with this investigation for the purpose of making it such that information does not become public or that charges are not brought could be caught up in the investigation. And that's another wrinkle in this story, so that there's a political story going on and there's a legal story going on. And Mueller has weapons that other people don't, and among those are the obstruction of justice charges. And so, as long as everybody is just going along treating this as, business as usual, well, then that's one thing. But if there's any proof that any of these people have interfered with the investigation for the purpose of stopping it, for interfering with a federal investigation, then that in and of itself is a crime.
We are just getting word from Senator Schumer's office saying that Schumer calls on the acting Attorney General Matthew Whitaker, to recuse himself from the Mueller probe. And this is a statement from Senator Schumer's office. It reads, given his previous comments advocating defunding and imposing limitations on the Mueller investigation, Mr. Whitaker should recuse himself for his oversight for the duration of his time as acting Attorney General. Caitlin, we talk a little bit about who has power, who has clout to counter this type of even though our Paula Reed's reporting that this is likely a temporary replacement. Can someone like a Schumer counter when you don't have a majority in the Senate?
They have very limited tools to go after this. And we're just also getting a statement from Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, who is saying, thanks to Jeff Sessions for his dedicated service. I wish him well and look forward to working with him in any future endeavors. You don't see any pushback or negativity about the president's decision to fire him.
I gotta say, if I'm Jeff Sessions, I've served side by side. I've conferenced with these guys together.
Right.
I've done so much together. I stretched my neck out for the president at the beginning. I've been lockstep with my party on issues. I kind of wonder what Sessions is feeling right now.
And you did hear a lot of sympathy for him before the midterms, and that is what really has changed here. That now senators, Republicans have an increased majority in the Senate. They know the president has long ago lost confidence, really, in Jeff Sessions, and they know they don't want to be having this battle here. So there are so many questions going about, but really Republicans at this point in time, according to Mitch McConnell's statement, really not going to fight him on this one.
I keep using the term radicalized, but purposefully, and it's because you can say embolden, you can say strengthen, you can say steel the spine, but the president has made that Republican caucus that, by the way, was a little flimsy at a certain point, right? Some of them weren't too sure about following the president blindly down any hallway or alleyway that he took them down. There's none of that anymore. There's no backup in this president and in the Republicans that are behind him. And that's very clear. That's clear from McConnell's statement. That's clear from seeing the transformation of Lindsey Graham and so many others that used to challenge this president or used to act as if they would be a check on this president. We don't see that. And you know why? It's because he's had relatively successful nights like last night, and they've seen that, as the president said rather inartfully, but he did say it, if you stay close to Trump, if you follow Trump, I got this. Basically follow me and I'll lead you to the light. And I think that Republicans are starting to act on that.
And I'm just getting word, my producer Sarah saying that Sessions was actually called by Kelly, General Kelly, in fact, and given the news. So it wasn't Trump himself. I don't know if we have that email here. What do you make of how this has sort of gone down? We had that press conference. I think it was our Major Garrett actually asked about whether he has faith, and it was interesting to see. I'd rather answer that at a little bit different time. That was 2 hours later. But
you really have to think this was coming for a very long time. Part of staying off this type of request for, a resignation was the fact that you did have the Senate, and particularly McConnell, saying that he wanted to delay that because you didn't know the political ramifications of doing that. And would it undermine the special counsel, or at least be perceived that way days before the midterm, weeks before the midterm? There was no way for Republicans to recover. And just 24 hours ago, we were talking about a blue wave that turned into a trickle. So now the dynamics have changed. The president is definitely seeing how far, and that's what's interesting about the president, and people appreciate that approach. How far can he push the traditional norms of how you run, the executive branch? And he can move people, in a day. He can wait until they're on a plane and decide to fire them by tweet. But this is interesting because we do not know if we already knew in advance the president was going to do this day of today, regardless of what he thought was going to happen. How long would it take for General Kelly to get him on the phone, for them to make an agreement, let me have my press conference, and then it's coming. So there's a lot of things that happen behind the scenes we just aren't privy to, but it's what is happening with this acting is, I think, the real question. And then people will be thinking about who the secretary is going to be, but I think whatever, on the positive side, whatever they're going to do to wind down the investigation is going to happen during that acting director time, and whatever is going to be done from a nefarious, if you have a negative perception, to manipulate the investigation would be done during that time as well.
One other thing I'd add, the Democrats we've heard from so far, Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, I believe, Jerry Nadler, those aren't the Democrats that you need to be looking out for. The Democrats you need to be looking out for are the ones that are going to put their names up for the presidency in 2020, because they are now the spokespersons for the party, in my opinion.
But do they have clout?
Well, but they will have clout, and the idea. I mean, sure, yes. Obviously, the House now, Democrats have the gavel, and they have control of several key committees of jurisdiction. But the voices that matter in terms of galvanizing the Democratic base and that are going to frame the discussion here are the Elizabeth Warrens. It's Bernie Sanders. It's Joe Biden. Okay, it's whether an Amy Klobuchar decides to throw her name into the ring. Others like that who are going to step forward, Cory Booker, Kamala Harris. Those are the people who you actually really need to be watching for, because I think you're going to start to see that there are going to be a couple different paths that are carved out. Some are work within the system to fight the president. Others are no prisoners. We need to go harder to our base. We need to pivot harder back to the left, so to speak. And I think that'll be very interesting to see how that develops as well.
You know, it was interesting earlier, McConnell also spoke out and said he warned about what he called presidential harassment. I mean, do Democrats have to be a little bit careful about how they proceed further with this?
Well, I was thinking about Kamala Harris and Cory Booker. They serve on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and they have used that platform, that setting as a platform, really. We saw that in the confirmation of several people, especially during Kavanaugh, and so they could have some sway here, interestingly enough. But, you know, we're also hearing from Lindsey Graham, a close ally of the president. He's saying, tweeting out that I look forward to working with Donald Trump to find a confirmable, worthy successor so that we can start a new chapter at the Justice Department and deal with both opportunities and challenges our nation faces. So again, not seeing that pushback, instead seeing support for this decision, it seems like.
I want to bring in and turn back now to CBS News security consultant and former assistant director to the FBI, Ron Hosko. Ron, you know, the fact that we've heard this news from Sessions at this point and we look into this Mueller probe, what do you think it means big picture?
Well, I hope it doesn't devolve very quickly after this election yesterday into open warfare between those proponents of an ongoing Mueller probe and the president and some of the folks around him, and you know, left versus right, however you want to define it. I hope it doesn't end up in people talking about a constitutional crisis. And I fear that that's the direction that we're going, that we're in a dangerous game of chicken now, where the president is perhaps reasserting himself. And where does the congressional language and resistance take us in the next few days? I think we're walking into the unknown. We're walking into the unknown, and it's concerning.
Typically, when these types of probes, I know you've worked on a lot of FBI investigations, but when there's something like a special counsel and somebody like this is fired, how significant is the person overseeing the probe at this point when you're talking in relation to this type of a probe that the special counsel Mueller team is looking into?
Yeah, I really think it's what's the special counsel focused on. So many special counsel, special prosecutor probes in the past have been on collateral officials, cabinet-level officials, but not really in the president's inner circle. And I think that's what distinguishes this. We can go back to others, whether you talk about Watergate or you talk about the Bill Clinton investigations. When it's focused on the president and we are as divided as we are, it is very, very concerning. It would be perhaps a bit easier to digest if the evidence was out there with us, where the media had an insight or where Bob Mueller was talking, so that we had full exposure to what we're dealing with. And so much of this has been tightly held. I think it makes it harder for all of us on the outside to weigh the value, the impact. How serious is this when we don't know? So we're left to speculate. We're left to speculate about the end game. We're left to speculate about the motives of the people that are playing in this three-dimensional chess game that we're dealing with. It makes it much more difficult. Much easier, I think, if all of that evidence was exposed to the light of day and we thought, hey, this is nothing, or this is really serious, keep going. And so here we are kind of sitting in the darkness watching this game play out.
If you're joining us now, we have just a short time ago received word that Attorney General Jeff Sessions has resigned at the request of President Trump, and his replacement will be his chief of staff. He will be the acting attorney general and will oversee the Mueller probe. Matthew Whitaker, also at the Department of Justice. You know, guys, I'm really struck. I'm kind of curious. What we don't know at this point was what that conversation was like with Chief of Staff John Kelly and with the Attorney General at the time, Jeff Sessions. I'm really struck by three words. The first three words of this letter from Sessions: at your request, I am submitting my resignation. Donald Trump is a guy who known for firing people. So why do it played out this way?
Well, this is how it's played out for others. Remember Rex Tillerson? We all learned about this via tweet. We saw the president tweet about this today. And the president has really been kind of dangling Jeff Sessions out there. All the while, Jeff Sessions has been very defiant in his position, kind of daring the president to fire him kind of at every instance that it came up, publicly talking about it and, you know, saying that he was doing his job here. So, you know, the fact that the president has done it now with a larger Senate majority. My question, too, is if Whitaker is not, it looks like Whitaker is not going to be the final choice, that the White House will be interviewing candidates. When does that all take place? And kind of what does that do in terms of momentum, either for the president or for Democrats?
I want to pick up on another point about timing. I saw on Twitter earlier, Maggie Haberman of the New York Times, very well-known journalist, tweeted out a copy of the letter and pointed out it was undated. And that's interesting to me because when was this actually submitted, and how long has the president and Chief of Staff Kelly been sitting on it? And I mean, clearly, this problem between the president and Jeff Sessions, the now former Attorney General, has been going on for a while. How long has the president been planning this? I do think that is somewhat material here to how this entire process is going to unfold. I think that'll be an interesting thing to be.
Based on the president's press conference today, I have to say, I mean, there was a significant part of this country that voted out Republicans because they wanted a check on the president. I mean, we saw the exit polling that says that there are Democrats and some independents even who came out and said they want to check on this president. But it doesn't appear, Leslie, that the president heard or is concerned.
Well, the check could mean a lot of different things, right? They want to check on his personality, kind of his unorthodox approach, his travel bans 1 minute, his tough approach on immigration on the other. What's the point that we haven't mentioned is that Sessions was a thorn to the president specifically because of the Russia probe, and that it led to the special counsel, and that he recused himself from that so that he no longer had influence or oversight over that investigation. It was not because of, he didn't implement a zero tolerance policy, when it came to immigration. It was not because, he didn't really embolden the FBI, who took so much criticism, but in the last several weeks has done an exceptional job.
But Leslie, what does that mean? Because the way the institution is supposed to work, the president just doesn't get to pick whoever he wants that'll go and do things the way he wants, right? I mean, the president does get the right to pick the attorney general.
He actually does get to do it.
He does get to do it. But what I'm saying is there are legal standards to uphold integrity. That's where I'm going at here. He has the right to pick whoever he wants, but what does it mean for the institution of the Department of Justice at this point?
Well, that's the fascinating question, because the bristle, where the rub was, is that Jeff Sessions came back and said, I do not feel in good conscience that I can do that. It's a matter of integrity. I refuse to allow us to be part of it and to politicize, this system and this process as it was moving forward. The president wanted it done in a very kind of businessman, chairman-like approach where solve the problem. And it could not get done because it's going through its processes. And that is a difficult part for the president to understand, especially when he's used to a commanding, execution of his ideas.
Two things here. One, I don't think the president fundamentally understands, actually, and I'm actually not even trying to be funny here. I don't think he really understands the role of the attorney general in this way. When he talks about Eric Holder and Barack Obama, he actually speaks as if, Eric Holder was so loyal to Barack Obama. It was as if Eric Holder was his personal attorney, and as if he was expecting Jeff Sessions to, quote unquote, give him that same loyalty. That'll be interesting in terms of who the president decides to fill this role with, because clearly loyalty is going to be A1 in terms of priorities of what this person is going to be like. Number two, let's take the lessons of the Brett Kavanaugh nomination over, what about 6 weeks ago? I'm losing track of time. Is it likely that the Republican caucus, at the behest of the president, is going to approve somebody that is a moderate conciliatory voice? Probably not, right? Mm-hmm. Because we know all the vitriol that was created from the Kavanaugh hearings, and in terms of Lindsey Graham saying things like, wait until you're in the majority, or wait until, I have a chance to be chair of this committee, and think about how I'm going to ramrod and I'm going to push things through this committee. There's so much vitriol that's been created, and the Kavanaugh hearings just stoked all of that bad feeling and those bad intentions, and I wonder how that's going to play itself out, particularly when it comes to this opening.
You mentioned Lindsey Graham, who has been somewhat of a thorn at some points of the president's administration, now very, very friendly with the president. He weighed in just about 20 minutes ago on Twitter, and he says, I look forward to working with the president, real Donald Trump, to find a confirmable, worthy successor so that we can start a new chapter of the Department of Justice and deal with both the opportunities and challenges our nation faces. As to me, I will be part of a larger Republican majority in the United States Senate, working with the president and my Republican and Democratic colleagues to make America safer and more prosperous. That was just Lindsey Graham just 20 minutes ago. I want to play a bite for you also from Lindsey Graham, the senator from August, on CBS This Morning, discussing the prospects of Sessions being fired.
Sessions did the right thing. We should praise him for doing the right thing.
A year ago, I said if you fired Jeff Sessions, there'd be holy hell to pay because Jeff recused himself. Trump blew up and went kind of crazy about it. And I said, wait a minute, Jeff had to. If you fire him for this, then it'll ruin your presidency. Mueller's investigation is very mature. The problems with Attorney General Sessions are deeper than recusal. I'm not going to give you a laundry list. There's nothing unethical here. But the problems between the White House and the president and Attorney General Sessions go well beyond the recusal. I hope they can repair these problems, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. The Department of Justice needs a voice that people in the White House will listen to. The Department of Justice needs leadership, and the president needs a cabinet he's competent in. None of that is inconsistent with Mueller doing his job as far as I'm concerned.
So you think the president has cause outside of the investigation to fire Jeff Sessions?
I think you serve at the pleasure of the president, and I think the removing of Jeff Sessions is deeper than just the recusal problem.
But serving at the pleasure of the president means the president could fire you if he didn't like your haircut. I mean,
truly.
But do you think is there a substantive basis?
Yeah, I think the immigration issue about the whole family was poorly handled. The zero tolerance problem, I don't know where that came from. And I think that sort of blindsided the president. The bottom line is this relationship is not working. It's not good for the Department of Justice. I have nothing against Jeff Sessions. I think he's a fine man. I like a lot of what he's done as Attorney General, but he's not my Attorney General. To my colleagues here, what is it about us that says you've got to be stuck with Jeff Sessions the rest of your political life because it may be hard for us to find a new replacement?
Well, I think they're saying don't get rid of him because
I'm saying you can't do anything before the election, but I'm not going to tell the president you're stuck with this cabinet person for the rest of your life, political life, because it will be hard on me is not a good answer.
Do you think there was some reporting in the paper that his lawyers told him don't get rid of Sessions until the Mueller report comes out?
That would be probably the smart thing to do if you want a new Attorney General. The problem with replacing the Attorney General is the Mueller investigation. I don't know how long it's going to take. Mr. Mueller's listening, just keep doing what you're doing. You just do your job, be fair by the president. I'm sure you will be. But for the country's sake, we need an Attorney General that can work with the White House. We need somebody that the Department of Justice can lead the organization effectively. And after the election, if Mueller's report's nowhere near being done and the president wants to pick somebody else, the burden on the president will be find somebody that we all have confidence in, accept the answer to the question, will you protect Mueller, being yes. And if you're willing to do those two things, you might get a new Attorney General. If you're not, you probably won't.
Let me ask you about the Mueller investigation. You said that...
All right, that was our John Dickerson interviewing Senator Graham just about 4 weeks ago. Our White House team just put out a note saying that senior aides tell CBS News that the president, and this is a quote, was itching to pull the trigger on this, but that he didn't because his senior aides told him not to do it. GOP Republican leadership told him, don't do it, wait until after midterms. He waited, not very long, but he did it pretty quickly. Hours later. What's your take?
It was the wild card, right? He didn't know the impact it would have on the midterm elections. Now we know the elections. As we see, we have an undated letter, so it could have happened at any time. We knew this was coming, and I think there's other parts. The president certainly circled the wagons with respect to making sure he knows who is leaking what. He got rid of the people who were leaking. He was not pleased when his own White House counsel spent 30 hours with the special counsel, discussing things, the inner workings of the White House. He didn't know that could be done, and they agreed to do it, but not to the extent of 30 hours. So the president has been bristling about a lot of this, and it probably fell at the heels of the Attorney General, no doubt, because he couldn't see it. He couldn't speak to him about it, and he was completely recused from it. So to have an ally, yes, but very good point on loyalty. All of this started because of the loyalty question and the independence that the Attorney General has to maintain. It is extremely important. And I think Lindsey Graham's point about if you cannot get someone who says they will not completely dissolve or terminate or disrupt, he didn't say disrupt, that's my word, the special counsel's investigation, then you're going to have a very hard time getting confirmation. My question goes back to what happens in those dark hours before you ever get that confirmation. You haven't acted.
Can I frame back for a second? I want to think about Barack Obama 2010, after that, as he called it, midterm shellacking, versus President Trump today. Okay, in 2010, does everyone remember what happened? The president came out, President Obama at that point, said we got shellacked, we got our tails kicked, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Got rid of Rahm Emanuel, brought in Mayor Daley's brother, William Daley, who was a more conciliatory voice to Republicans, built an entire strategy around working with Republicans. That's not what we've seen today. Just in 24 hours.
That's not how he rolls. I can't imagine the day that might happen.
But just think about this president and how radically different of a reaction today is to what we saw from President Obama 8 years ago in a very, I would say, similar situation. House losses, have to work in divided government now, have to figure out a way to make it work. President Trump has said, you know what, I'm going to give lip service to all the, I'll work with Nancy Pelosi, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but I'm going to double down and I'm going to actually get on my, as he said, war posture. I think that's fascinating.
I want to actually play for you guys. Hang on one second. I want to play for you a soundbite from the president just a few hours ago when he was asked about this at the press conference at the White House.
The investigation by the special counsel Robert Mueller has been going on since last spring. It's been over your head. It's been a long time. Yeah, it's been over your head, over Republicans' head, during the midterms as well. Is this an opportunity for you, Mr. President, to end that investigation? Would you consider removing Mr. Mueller from his position?
I could have ended it any time I wanted. I didn't. And there was no collusion. There was no anything. I didn't. They went after hackers in Moscow. I don't know about that. They went after people with tax problems from years ago. They went after people with loans and other things. Had nothing to do with my campaign. This is a investigation where many, many millions of dollars has been spent, and there's no collusion. It was supposed to be on collusion. There's no collusion, and I think it's very bad for our country. I will tell you. I think it's a shame. And a poll came out today, by the way, from NBC, or at least I saw it on NBC, where a majority of the people do not agree with the Mueller investigation, or it wasn't approved. They have approval and disapproval, and it had a much higher disapproval. It should end, because it's very bad for our country.
So if it's bad...
And I'm not just talking about the tremendous expense. And the other thing is they should look at the other side also. They only look at one side. They're not looking at all of the things that came up during this investigation. They don't do that. They should also get people that can be fair, not 13 or 14 or 17. I call them the angry Democrats. They are angry people. And it's a very unfair thing for this country. It's a very, forget about unfair to me, it's very bad for our country.
The angry Democrats. Leslie, there obviously is a group of people who believe that, buy that.
Look at the fact the president is citing a poll that he saw where he's reading the populist movement, right? He's finally seen an uptick in the number of people who are saying this probably needs to come to an end. They're disapproving of the special counsel's investigation. I don't think this is going to be news to Bob Mueller, though. I think he very much knew that there was a clock ticking, and it's accelerated in terms of his ability to deliver something at least meaningful in a shorter amount of time. I think that's what the Congress is going to be looking at, whether it's this Congress or the next one. And those are all, this is not anything we didn't know. We knew that there was a lot of consternation and a lot of frustration with that relationship. The question is, who within the White House is going to really take hold of helping push through the next Attorney General, at least the nominee?
And you heard the president in that clip there saying no collusion, no collusion. That's what he has really focused on as it relates to the Mueller probe. Meanwhile, the administration has acted on information indictments that have come out from the Mueller probe as it relates to Russian interference, issuing sanctions against Russia in reaction to the evidence found about meddling in that investigation. But the president has been focused only on these allegations of collusion, and that is something that he has appealed to his supporters and to Republicans who either voted for him or support the party to say that, look, Democrats are going back to those angry Democrats that he talks about, which is not true, but saying that, look, they're trying to take away or interfere with what you voted for and what you've wanted to do. And that appeal has been effective, I think, among Republican voters. And he saw that in those races last night on the Senate side. What's interesting about this president, going back to your point about Obama, is that he doesn't see any political consequences, apparently, for really anything. You could say that the Democrats taking over the House last night was an indictment of sorts on the president, but the president is not taking it that way. In fact, he's going the opposite way and really doubling down on his base.
You know, we did talk a little bit earlier about 2010 when Barack Obama made the big changes and all. Bill Clinton did the same thing in 1990, after the 1994, when the Republicans took over for the first time in 40 years. And it wasn't until Leon Panetta became chief of staff and set up executive management in a way that worked on how the president could work effectively, because it is a system. The executive office of the president is a very difficult thing to learn to manage. And he's going to need, quite honestly, realistically, a new chief of staff who knows how to work with a contentious legislature that's not your party. Because right now he's been managing the president, if you would say with General Kelly. You're moving into a different kind of a new role and a new season.
I'm curious to see how Democrats broadly, rank and file are going to receive this, because I really do think there is a part of the Democratic Party that has somewhat not written off the Mueller probe or the Russian investigation, but understands the political optics of it and understands that it doesn't necessarily feed into Democrats' political benefit to spend the next 2 years arguing about Russia. I think it's pretty clear what probably happened, what didn't happen, whether or not that's going to be litigated in Congress. I think there's a lot of Democrats who would say, you know what? Don't take the president's bait. It's very obvious to me the president has no problem luring Democrats into a 2-year fight about this, or maybe it's not 2 years, but maybe it's a 6-month fight about this. He has absolutely no problem doing that. And I think Democrats have a real question. I think there's going to probably be a meeting at some point today with Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and the head of the DNC, Tom Perez, and maybe even some of these 2020 hopefuls, their leadership, where they're going to have to start to talk and say, okay, what are we actually going to do here? What's our response going to be? Are we going to go and fight the president on the headlines every day about this? Or are we going to start talking about the things that we claim to think that voters actually care more about, like health care, like the economy, like all of the other things that President Trump does that offends not just the Democratic base, but a lot of independents around the country.
A lot of factors to weigh in there. I want to thank you all for joining us. Leslie, Caitlin, Joel, appreciate your insights with this breaking news. Well, we're going to take a quick break. We've got a lot more news ahead. You're streaming CBS ahead.
Sorry, I need a drink.